have a lot to cover. So, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining. I think this webinar has been due for a while, and there are a lot of people who I see on a regular basis who are interacting with the content. Some of them on the call right now, some of them are joining. So I'm really happy. And usually I've been speaking at conferences, but I never had a chance to talk to you guys on a webinar where you can join in as well. So I'm really happy that we're doing this. So today's topic is something which I've been working on for a while now, and I'm sure you all will be really excited about the discussion we're going to have today. So let me begin by saying, usually whenever we talk about DevOps, a strategy for your team, right? The first thing that comes to my mind, at least whenever I go to a new place, a new organization, the first thing that is usually asked of me is, okay, can you give us a test strategy for us and build something? And their idea of a test strategy is usually this is going to be the silver bullet that is going to solve all the problems, and it is going to somehow magically show everything that is happening across the testing landscape, right? And I think some of you might have the same feeling who have been in the industry for a while. So just listening to that, all right, let's do a test strategy, that's not really a very enthusiastic thing that you want to listen to, right? The first thing you come in, and that's often the ask, and it's a genuine ask from management in terms of they really need to understand what's happening, what is the plan, how are we going to work out things. And as we move along and we spend some time developing these strategies, and folks start building stuff, and we have something in the pipeline, takes us weeks to build something, discuss with different people the tech stack, how things are working. Eventually, when we have something in place, it's more of we are the only ones who are interacting with that strategy, and not necessarily everyone is involved with it, right? And that kind of takes out the whole purpose of why the strategy was built in the first place. And that kinds of puts us off into building a test strategy. And this is a theme which happens again and again, and that is why in our the recent transformation that I've been doing for teams now, I've been trying to work out for a while to develop something which actually teams can work with. And that is why, I came up with the idea of a test strategy around which can transform your team's behavior and is useful at the same time. So a test strategy meaning something which can help you transition from point A to point B. Point A being in the old world with the old ways of working, and point B in a more of a DevOps and agile culture, where you can adopt practices to deliver quickly and with quality, right? So to develop something which can help with that transition, the strategy, usually you have those behemoth documents and not necessarily always very happy to work with those, right? So it has to be something very easy to maintain, and I've struggled with that myself over the years. And lastly, it is not going to work unless it's for the whole team involved, unless we don't involve everyone across the spectrum who is involved with the day-to-day of delivering a product. It's not going to work. So it has to be inclusive for the whole team. So a little bit about me. I help teams transform their practices, their quality practices, into a more DevOps and agile methodology. I've been doing it for a while. I'm also heavily involved with data engineering and data science. And I do a lot of trainings and workshops. You can find me on social, and I think I do recognize a lot of names there. So I think you've seen my social media posts, so you do know me. So I'm very easy to reach out, and let's take the conversation after this session over there. A few things I want to highlight. The chat. I'm not sure if everyone has used GoToMeeting before, so I'll be asking a few questions, I promise that we'll make this interactive. It won't be just me saying something. I want you guys to hear from you guys as well. So just showing the chat icon up there, so you can whenever we have a discussion, so you can add your thoughts in the chat section. And for questions, you can just put a question and colon, and just keep adding your questions during the talk, and I'll stop in between at different stages, and then we can answer them as we go along instead of doing it at the end, which makes it kind of a monotonous thing where just I'm talking and I'm not hearing anything back from you guys. Okay, so we're going to talk about three basic things today. First, we'll talk about the traditional test plans, right? So when we say it's dysfunctional, why does it end up being dysfunctional, right? And the next step is about the DevOps test strategy mind map, which is how is that different, and how does that help get away from the problems we are going to see with traditional test plans. And lastly, I'll go into a bit of detail into the structure of the DevOps strategy mind map and how you can go about using it or tweaking it for your teams. All right, so let's get into it. So traditional test plans, right? Now, there are a lot of things which happen due to which we end up with the test plans that we do. And one of them is this them versus us mentality, right? So let me explain. So we have a development team, we are a Scrum team, and we have some developers on them, depending on how further you are in your agile journey. So you may or may not have a wall between you and your between the testers and the developers, right? So they design some, they commit their code and they throw it over and say, okay, now this is set to QA, and now QA is supposed to test everything, and then we try to test and find whatever we can. And when we are done with our testing, eventually we then try to throw it over to another wall into production, saying that all right, now you guys deal with it and we're done, right? And usually in the old world, the test strategy document isn't necessarily just to explain how we're going to do tests, but it's also around, it's more of a disclaimer saying that, look, from this wall to this wall, this is what we'll be doing, right? So if anything falls in the scope of this one, that's what we're interested in. Otherwise, if it falls out of this scope, we don't. And we kind of treat it, it is in some cases, mostly it should be a plan, but then sometimes it goes into not just being just a plan, it turns into a contract and more of a disclaimer statement that, look, this is all we are going to cover with the given limitations, and beyond this, if something comes back, we are not going to look into it, because, and it's only natural that it's more around ways of working of the organization. Because if there is an issue and you come and management comes back and asks testers, of course they're going to have their guards up, and they'll have these kind of commitments saying that, we need to limit our scope. So, and that's kind of one of the reasons why we end up with those documents. Then we come up with terms like, okay, the entry exit criteria. I understand it's important to just know what we are going to do at each stage across the SDLC, but then for us it's more about, as soon as it's thrown over the wall, our timer starts, and then we have a timer of ending that job, and we have to complete within it, right? So we try to control when it comes into our bucket and when it's supposed to go out of our bucket, so this time we can manage, right? So you have the entry exit criteria, you have the time duration, of course. Out of scope, we sometimes clearly try to mention, okay, these are the tests we are going to run, and these are the tests that we will not run, right? Or just these are the ones that we are going to run. And anything outside of this, if it fails, that isn't necessarily a quality problem, because given the restrictions we had, this is what we could do, right? And tests to be covered. So, and you see where this is going, right? And I'm not saying this is with every place, but generally speaking, this is kind of, it eventually morphs into some kind, this sort of a discussion, again depending on where you are in your agile journey. And because of this, it has a disconnect with the reality of exactly what's happening on a day-to-day basis within the teams, right? So we say, okay, ideally our test strategy document says that we're supposed to do this test, but in reality we don't get time. Sometimes it's just so hard with the pressures, we don't have the tools necessarily, not everyone is abiding to the test strategy. So it turns that there is a big gap between what the test strategy document says and exactly what we do on a day-to-day basis, right? And also it has to do with it because it becomes hard to digest the document, right? And for leadership especially, I mean, they come in, as I said in the start, they come in and ask us for, I need a test strategy from you guys, you need to explain to me how we are going to do testing. And but when you go back with this giant set of documentation, they're not really in the mood to go through all of those 30 pages, right? Or how many pages they are. So it's a bit laborious. And even in the engineers on the team, they don't always go through the whole thing. And it's usually the person who designed it, he refers it once or twice back, and often there is a discussion, but that's the end of it, right? It also creates a problem in maintaining that, because uh, the sheer amount that we have, and also it takes too much time to update and think. And especially if you're doing this in a silo, like the testing team is individually trying to build the test strategy, they do have some discussions here and there with the developers, but it isn't necessarily they're not necessarily, whatever they do isn't part of the test strategy, right? So again, we have to, the test strategy is supposed to be something which is supposed to bring down the wall, not keep the wall, right? That wall has to come down. And that's the last point here, that we lose track of our target vision. And if this is the current state, ideally we want to remove that wall first, and then we start to kind of learn each other's skills. So and that's the DevOps culture eventually, where we want to be, where there is a skill overlapping as we move along. The developers learn to test well, and testers gain more understanding of the production code and the tech stack. And eventually, as the cycle progresses over years and as it moves along, that is where we reach a point eventually where we have this ideal case where everyone on the team is completely gelled in, and they all contribute equally towards testing, right? Which is the ideal world, the utopia where we want to be. Of course, not every team is going to get there, but at least we should try to have as much of that intersection over there as possible. Okay, so now we move on to an interesting part. I've shared what I have seen over the years, and probably you guys must have seen the same. So this is a quick survey. I'll post the link in the chat as well. So you can have a look at it from there as well. And let's have a look and see how people, what has your experience been in this regard. Oops, that's, I didn't know it was okay. There you go. So I've pasted the link in the chat. If you could quickly do that poll, and let's see what results we come up with. Let me get this here. In the meanwhile, let me have a look at the poll. I hope everyone can see the chat. So if you go in your, let me just drag this over here so you guys can see. Okay, so it's in the chat. The URL, I try to make it easier, so even if you can't access it, you can still go through it. All right, I'm seeing some votes coming in. Excellent. I know sometimes polls aren't necessarily the most popular choice with folks, but it's an easy way to quickly. Otherwise, then log answers, articulating them become a problem. Okay. Okay. Yeah, all right. We're almost there. Very good. All right. So let me share the results here. Um, so we have around um, 30% say known to everyone but not followed, and 70% say it's not really defined, right? So that kind of, gives an aggregate of where we are, generally speaking. And this is a common theme which goes across the industry. I mean, you are the 30% there are the outliers, I have to tell you. The rest of them, that's kind of the majority. Even in some mature organizations, you'd see the same. We've got another one, written but not referred to. Excellent, awesome. All right, so let's move on. And I hope, as we move along, this session is going to be really helpful for you guys. Okay, so why DevOps test strategy mind map? It's a mouthful, I know, and I tried to come up with a short one, but it was either the thing would make sense and it has to be long, or it's short and it does not make sense. So I stuck with, okay, I'll just abbreviate the thing, and at least the long name, it should make some sense. So that's what it is. Now, as I said, in the last couple of months, I've been trying to transform a lot of different teams with various different backgrounds, with very different tech stacks. And and I was struggling to figure out a way to actually build something for them which they can take home with them and develop on themselves very easily, right? That was the objective. And in that quest, I kind of I've always been a fan of mind maps, and that is how I ended up with building this as a mind map, right? So and let's go into each section and talk about it one by one. And as we move along, and this is an evolving document for me even, and as I walk through different teams and I talk to different thought leaders. For instance, I've had discussions with Lisa Crispin on this. I've had discussions with a bunch of other people on this tool, if you will, to get their experiences and their knowledge as well. And initially designing this, I should mention this, a lot of different concepts that you see around, for instance, the agile testing quadrants, and from scaled agile perspective, the DevOps health radar, and a lot of different tools. We try to make sure that the important ones are in here and they make sense for the teams, right? So it's a learning process. uh, why now about the title, right? This long name, why are we stuck with this long name? So DevOps, first thing, it's about a collective ownership, right? We talked about this earlier a little bit. Collective ownership, we want people to collectively own this process. It shouldn't be a one person thing. Also, the strategy should talk to all the different stages across the SDLC, not necessarily that small box of testing which is between the development wall and the production wall. Quality is not built there. Quality is, it happens way before shift left and all of that, right? Lastly, automation, right? So sometimes it happens, all right, we have a test strategy, but our automation strategy is a bit different, or automation strategy is sitting somewhere else. No, no, the whole team has one automation strategy, which is part of one document. You can call it whatever you want, but it has to be one piece, right? um, there are a lot of stages in the DevOps world. When you talk about building pipelines and how your tests are supposed to run in pipelines, then we have a lot of different stages to go through. And this document should talk through, should give an idea of what stages of tests we are talking about and what tests are supposed to happen, right? Hence the name DevOps. Test strategy. So there's always confusion between test plan and test strategy. I wanted to make that clear. So the why of testing. That is for me the starting point of when we talk about testing, the why of testing, right? So first talk about why we want to test, and that is supposed to be driven by our business goals. And our business goals are going to then tell us what our test policy is going to be. That is our test goals. That gives us our why. And you would be surprised, depending on what your product is trying to achieve, your why is going to change significantly, right? Then the next is how we want to test. We create a generic template, a target vision, right? And that's what a test strategy is for me. It's a blueprint. It's a blueprint of B world where we want to be in the future. Now we are not there today. So what about that? So that's going to be your test plan. So looking at that target vision, then you remove the areas where we are today, and let's say we say, okay, for the next, let's say 3 months, this is where we want to be incrementally, or 1 month, whatever duration cadence you want to make it. And then we derive a test plan saying that this is what we are going to achieve as a first iteration. So your test strategy is a vision, and your test plan is a roadmap to your test strategy, which keeps evolving over time, right? So that's how I see a test strategy and a test plan. As I said, what happened, and I've done this mistake. Either we get stuck with the target vision, saying that we are so consumed by this is where we want to be, and we build our journey from here till the end, every step in detail. And that is completely anti-agile. We know that we cannot predict things, especially in software development, very well. So the trick is have a very clear vision, which is your test strategy. Have a very clear vision of where you want to be, but the journey will be unexpected. So you plan only for as much, right? You do that in iterations, and it is expected it's going to change. So why plan the whole thing till the end? Lastly, mind maps. So compared to documents and checklists, and I've tried all sorts of things, I find mind maps very helpful. Even for test cases, I also try to I try to build mind maps for test cases. Even it makes things, especially for checklists, it makes things a lot easier for me. Okay, so I've been talking a lot. Now it's your turn. So after listening to this, what do you think for yourself or for your team? You would do you see a difference from a test plan and a test strategy for you? And if you do feel a difference, what do you think would be the frequency of how quickly or how slowly you'd like to change them? Would that be in your organization? Would that be something which is a weekly thing, or a few months, or it's a yearly thing? How frequently do you see this happening? If it doesn't happen, just drop a message in the chat. We'll give it a minute or two. Let's see the sentiment in the room, and let's take it from there. I kind of put you guys on the spot, huh? Okay, quarterly, good. All right. Sprintly or bi-sprintly? All right. So if it's a sprintly, then it has to be very quick. Bi-sprintly, yeah, that's a month. All right. In every sprint, okay. Quarterly, strategy, and annually. Okay, that's an interesting answer. Plan quarterly and the strategy is annually. All right. Yeah, yeah. So, and to be honest with you, there is no right answer saying that this is the right answer, right? Okay. I think the yearly for the strategy, and as often as the code is changed for the test plan. All right, we're being more agile, right? So and that's kind of what works for you is the best, right? And you're going to learn that through trial and error. No one can come in and say, okay, this is how it's supposed to be done across. There is no silver bullet. We have to find out what works for our situation. All right, good stuff. Okay, so let's move on to the next section. Now, introduction to the DevOps test strategy mind map. And I'll spend a little bit time here so I can go into details of these subjects. So first, let me summarize the DTSM's the whole mind map, right? And I've created the small version of it where I talk about the very high level important areas, right? And you can see they are a bit color coded, right? Now let me bring in the colors. So the first section here is the quality vision, right? Now the quality vision is to talk about, remember we talked about this, the test policy, where we said what is the business objective and what should be the test objectives. This is that section, right? So we talk about what business where business wants to go, which area we should focus our we should focus our energies on, and then what we should measure, right? And that's going to be your quality vision part. Then we have ways of working. Ways of working has to do more with your automation practices, testing practices in terms of building, developing frameworks, test data generation, for instance, for automation, for exploratory testing, different techniques of testing, effective test case writing skills, using checklists, how to maintain regression, all of that. So that's more around ways of working on a routine basis. Tools is more around, not in my book, it isn't necessarily use this tool or that tool, it's more around what kind of tools do we want to think about that are required for us. And then the last, and so the left hand side is all about is all about more strategic in nature, right? So it's something you might not change very often, but the right hand side is something which is on a day-to-day basis you would work with your teams, right? So and you see the numbering over there. That is why there is a numbering, because that is the sequence in how your SDLC is going to go. Okay, so and now let's talk about starting with the left hand side, where there is the vision and the strategic direction for your teams, right? First up, quality vision. We talked about the quality objectives, leading lagging indicators, very important, and your quality roadmap, right? Um, and of course, for all of these sections, I do have a separate workshop which I do for each section, and we develop that with teams. But out of here, I'm just going to summarize everything very quickly. So for instance, the quality objectives, we talk about again what our quality criteria is. Automation objectives I've added separately. And as you, I think most of you know, I mean, sometimes we have very unrealistic expectations of automation or not accurate expectations, which is something which has to be aligned as part of this section, right? Quality culture, like it's a team responsibility. How do we make it a team responsibility? And some ways of working, things like lean processes, which we talked about earlier, right? Let's not plan everything in detail, let's be lean and agile about things, right? So it's more about agile ways of working, definition of done. So again, now these are the few things that I have seen in teams which usually lack all the time, right? There could be things which are on your radar but not necessarily are shown up here. So definitely, those are the things you'd add related to culture in this section, right? Then we have roles and responsibilities. To be honest, in an agile world, you don't necessarily have to be very rigid about roles and responsibilities. I mean, probably that heading even shouldn't be there, but it's good to have in terms of having a general understanding of, okay, is automation going to be maintained just by the automation guy over there sitting in the corner, or is it something that as a team we own? And if something goes wrong, we all jump on it and we try to fix it, right? So just an example, right? So that's where roles and responsibilities come in. Exploratory testing, is it just the tester's job at the end, that guy is supposed to bust his head and find some issues, or are the developers also going to pitch in into that, for example, right? So in terms of what activities need to be which roles are supposed to also involve in other activities. Test stages, this is more around learning. It's around teaching teams to test on the lower levels of the tech stack, an understanding of agile testing. And I've mentioned the agile testing quadrants there deliberately because that gives it's a very good next step of the automation pyramid. So that's around more of an education for the teams. KPIs and OKRs, which KPIs to measure? This is a long standing issue, and I think all of you on the call have been through this as to what KPIs we need to measure, right? And over the years, these are the few ones that I've learned, which makes more sense to me. So those are the ones that I added. But definitely anything that you feel as a group which can be measurable and it makes sense. For instance, counting how many bugs were reported in each sprint. I don't know if that's a very good metric. I'm not sure if we report, if we, for instance, if we reported 5 bugs in sprint 1 and 10 bugs in sprint 2, what does that mean? That we were doing sloppier development in sprint 2, or we were doing good testing in sprint 2? We don't know, right? So it has to, add some value. Quality roadmap. This is something we spend a lot of time on usually in workshops, where we talk about prioritizing and building technical enablers, right? So all this automation that you're going to see is doesn't happen overnight. There's a lot of enablers that need to be built in order for all these things to happen in an automated fashion. For instance, your deployments, your test runs, your results, code check-ins, merges, all of that. There's a lot of infrastructure which goes into it. And to build all of that, you need to spare some capacity in order to build it. And that's where the quality roadmap comes in. Next section is ways of working, right? So it's around how to test well. And unfortunately, I've in my experience, when we try and build automation for teams, we end up spending more time trying to fix testing first. I mean, because the testing practices aren't as efficient, the test case management isn't efficient, and they're bogged down with running these very basic regression runs, and they don't necessarily get time to think and analyze and collaborate with people in order to identify the risks, right? How to do automation well, again, a big challenge, and lean practices. So this section is all around ways of working. And you can add, and I've added automation and exploratory testing only, but certainly, for instance, if CI is completely new in your space, and we don't have enough learning going around, so CI, continuous integration, setting up pipelines, could certainly be a part of the section. So what I have added is automation practices, code quality and code review. For us, what does code quality mean? Some basic naming conventions, some basic commenting, some design patterns, right, which we want to stick to. Automation design, pillars of automation framework design, again, not necessarily universal term, something I coined. Maintainability, reusability, scalability, and robustness. When building an automation framework, it needs to have these characteristics in order for it to be mature enough that you can take it forward as your requirements change. Automated test results and dashboard telemetry. I'm big time on reporting. I hate those reports where it doesn't tell me anything except a green or a red. That does not really help. Quarantine flaky tests. So whatever automation practices you envision in your target state, you can add them here. These are a few that I feel are often lacking in teams, which is why I've added them here. Exploratory testing, some understanding of risk-based testing and how testing should work, and context-driven testing, because I think the rapid software testing community has done a great job in terms of codifying how to do testing well, right? Testing at the lower levels of the tech stack. Uh, it's not just automation that has to happen on the lower levels, it's testing also. Uh, writing tests in an agile way. Again, this is usually a 2-hour workshop which we do, and we talk about, okay, how to develop test cases, which are easy to maintain, what tests we want to write in a test case management tool, what can be part of a checklist, and so on and so forth. definition of regression and how to maintain regression, right? That's again a big problem because we end up with this big suite of regression tests. So those are a few things around practices. Then we move on to tooling. Now with tooling, and I think this is something we get really hung up on, right? What tool are we going to use? The tool is not going to solve the problems. The tool is just, it's as good as the way we use it, right? So, and my thought process behind this section isn't necessarily about which tools are better, but it's more around which tools we should, which type of tools you may want to consider in your environment, right? That's the objective here. So for instance, for testing tools, we talk about test case management, checklist. What kind of tool do you want to use a checklist for? It has to be mind maps, can it be a Confluence page with bullet points? So you see, if you don't have checklist, now this is going to get you thinking, oh, okay, what is this checklisting? Why do I need to have this, and how does this help, right? And that's the whole idea. Frequently usable testing tools. For us, tooling is just for automation. There is a lot, we need a lot of probes to get into our application and a test and try to look at things under the hood, right? So for instance, looking at the services, using the developer tools for looking at the response of your pages. um, these kind of basic tools, they help you, and not necessarily testing tools per se, but they are tools which are going to help you significantly in doing exploratory testing, right? Then we have mocking. Again, now a lot of teams, they just don't have mocking, right? And this will beg the question, okay, all right, why do we need mocking, right? So we talk about what tools, why do you want to develop mocking, and how and when to use it. Similarly, for test data creation, generally test data creation is, and depending on your problem statement, sometimes it's a very big issue, sometimes it's not that much, but regardless, wherever you are in the complexity spectrum of test data generation, you need to have a very good strategy around it, especially if you want your automation to be successful, right? Otherwise it's definitely going to fail. Then finally we talk about automation tools. So in automation tools, we talk about environments, how do we want to deploy them, which are running pre-deployment, post-deployment, which tools do we want to use, frameworks that we want to build around those tools. For me, frameworks are more important than the tool itself. Reporting, logging, and some practices around that section. So all of this combined now becomes, something important for me around tools. So you see, this whole section is more around thinking about what we want to get out of different tools instead of talking about which tool to use, right? And I think that creates a paradigm shift for teams. All right, again, I've done enough talking. So now, on just what we just talked about, if there are anything that we would like to discuss or talk about, let's bring that up in the chat. Okay, lovely. We have a few questions here. Let me answer those, and please keep adding new ones. So Sharon is asking, can you elaborate on mean time to report issues? What does that mean? Great question. And I'm sorry, some of these things, I know there is a lot of technical jargon in there, and not everything would be clear. This is a 2-3 day long workshop that we do, right? So, and I just try to condense everything and just give you a very short synopsis. So mean time to report issues for me is, as a developer or as an engineer, when I commit my code, the time from when I commit my code till the time the issue gets raised in Jira or an automation report. For example, person A committed some code today, and 3 hours later, my automation run in my CI pipeline fails. It's giving me feedback that the test has failed. So that is my time to report, 3 hours. Again, the next time I did a commit, it went through the pipeline, everything passed in the pipeline. We had nightly runs, it passed all the nightly runs. then it was caught in exploratory testing, which was, let's say, for argument's sake, just 3 or 4 days down the line, right? So now in this case, it was 4 days. So you aggregate all of these different timings and you end up with a mean time to how long it takes us to report. And some of these are going to be after production, after deployment, right? So that is going to give you your mean time to report issues. And where we don't have a lot of strong automation practices, this time is going to be very long, right? And the whole point here, or one of the objectives here, is to reduce that time, right? And if you set up Jira in a way where your Jira issues are tagged against commits, this becomes very easy. It can become an automated process. Otherwise, I know it can be challenging, but it's just how you structure your Jira project if you're using Jira. All right, the next question is, what are the KPIs for automation? Good question, Musarat. KPIs for automation. For me, the only KPI for automation that is, I think, is dead on is flakiness, right? So what is our flakiness percentage? That gives a very good idea of how strong our automation is, because that's usually one big problem. Another KPI, I wouldn't necessarily call that a KPI, to be honest, is for me is more around how much time now testers are spending on actual testing rather than running regression tests, right? That for me is another measure, but it's hard to get that one. That's why I don't usually mention it. The other measures which we talked about, automation is going to affect those measures eventually, right? So that is why we try to measure those. And there's a significant difference here. When we're talking about measuring a practice, our assumption is, okay, if we do all this automation, our quality is going to skyrocket, right? So we measure how good we are complying to this practice, and we build measures around that problem. How good are we complying to this practice? However, it isn't a given or 100% that if I do this practice by the book, my quality or speed of delivery is going to improve, right? So for me, I personally feel that yes, these measures are good, but more important measures are what the actual outcome is, which is how quickly are we releasing now, how much issues are coming back from production, and what is our average time of reporting issues, right? So that's real quality of the product, right? So along with these measures, those are helpful. Then Musara's question, how to convince management that automation is not for automation team? All right, that's for that one. We'll have to spend another hour here. But in short, I think it's more of a ways of working. And to be honest, I think it has to be a management mindset. It has to come from as an organization ways of working. And I know if that if that understanding isn't coming from the top, it's very hard to build from the bottom up. You can fight, you can pick and choose your battles. Some things you can argue, but a lot of them you can't. I heard about the strategy to be implemented, but most teams avoid this step. So how can we take strictly follow this process? Implementing the strategies is hard, and I've mentioned a couple of reasons why it usually becomes hard. So I think as an MVP, try and build something very small and very basic, right? You have this target vision. You don't take the whole target vision. Try and build something very concise and very small for what we have today. And it should be like you look at it and in 30 seconds you just get it, right? And as we move along, then we try and improve and add on to it. It's a tough question, don't get me wrong. How to convince management when automation is not finding more bugs as automation is done around stable functionality? All right, another question around automation. um, and yeah, I think again here I'd say it's more of a ways of working, and it's more around explaining, it's around how good you are at convincing or explaining the situation, right? And all these practices that we're talking about, ways of working, and which was essentially the whole section that we went through, is just to build that understanding. So and a big portion of this workshop isn't necessarily for engineers. It is equally important for product owners and engineering managers, because those ways of working are to be driven by them guys, right? So that's where this becomes really important. Okay, so I think I've answered those questions as quickly as I could. Let's move on to the next section, which is activities across the SDLC. All right. So in this section, this is around quality practices that need to happen on a day-to-day basis, right? On a day-to-day basis, what we want to get involved with. All right, feature and sprint planning. When we say sprint planning, our assumption, our understanding, or my understanding for a long time has been, okay, this is the user story. My goal here is just to understand what this story says. And I think that's where the mistake is. The product owner doesn't necessarily have all the information in his head. They don't know. They are human beings. That is why we are doing agile in the first place. We don't know everything. So we don't have to just agree with what they're saying. It's a dialogue, and we have to iron out collectively with them when we actually develop this, what is going to come out of it. There are going to be a lot of, and I've seen this time and again, when you do behavior driven development sessions or three amigo sessions with the POs, they learn a lot of things which they didn't necessarily understand before, and that changes the requirements. And when that discussion doesn't happen, right, we end up just accepting what is given. We develop everything, and after months we realize it doesn't work, or rather it surfaces it doesn't work. We have a hunch, we feel it's not going to work. I mean, it doesn't make sense, there are a few loopholes here and there, but we just implement it because you know what, this was assigned to us in a story, we have to finish this and let's just get done with it, right? And that's where the problem is. So that's why this is the first section around feature planning and sprint planning. Now, if you're a large organization, you will have feature planning, right? You might have a lot of release train, a lot of feature teams or scrum teams, and who have to interact with one another in a large enterprise. So over there, you would have feature planning, or if you're implementing scaled agile, right? If you are not a very large organization, then sprint planning, of course, you would be having, right? And that's, you know, that these are the two big sections. Clarify what to develop. And three amigo session is what I was talking about. Definition of done. We do a whole workshop on definition of done. Extremely critical. And I think if you've been following me, you've seen a lot of posts that I do. I'm really passionate about, you know, getting definition of done right. NFIs for non-functional requirements, which is your SLAs, like how your performance measures. What is your performance expectation? Not every story will have it, every user story, but a lot of them should. Right? Then dependencies. Again, depending on how complex your product is, dependencies across different products, dependencies within your product. If there are some things which are underdeveloped or haven't been finished, are we mocking those? How are we planning to test those? How are we going to do the end-to-end customer journey? These questions are usually asked when it is thrown over the wall to the testers. That is not the time to discuss this. The time to discuss these things is when we are planning for a sprint and talking about a user story. That is when this should be discussed, right? And what's happening, what can happen is, if we have a lot of unknowns, you can just park that story there and then, instead of pushing it into a sprint, going halfway there and then realizing we don't have all the tools to do this through to the end, and now it's just sitting somewhere in you know, parked in progress or something. Okay, the next one is continuous integration. So we've done our sprint planning, we've done our feature planning, and then sprint planning. Now we talk about, now the code building has started to happen, right? So activities around coding and what does need to happen on every pull request, right? That's the continuous integration piece. So the first step, coding. And this is where the test planning section I add, and I'm really big on risk analysis. So inside out risk analysis happens here, right? You pair with the developer while they are developing, and once they have developed their story, you sit with them and discuss, okay, this is how your design works, and what happens if this goes off, and what happens if we get such value from there. Because a developer cannot think, any person who is developing their stuff cannot come into that frame of mind of questioning his own assumptions. They don't even know they have those assumptions, so it has to be someone else who has to question those assumptions, right? And that is where this happens. Then you have code reviews, and code reviews, a big thing that I usually ask for is the feature testable? So for instance, a very basic example is if it's a UI page that is being built, we know that we are going to do some UI automation. Are the identifiers, object identifiers, unique in there? They're supposed to be unique so automation can, work effectively. If it's a service, if it's an API service, do we have the documentation in place, Swagger, whatever? Do we have the checks on the fields? Are they happening on my service level, or they're happening on my UI and nothing is being checked on my service level, right? So those are the kind of questions which are going to come up at this stage. So ideally, a lot of things that we talk about in testing in a later stage, once it's tagged as for QA, that should happen here. Now, once the developer has done, some discussion has happened, we've identified some things, we've identified some unit tests, they've written those, and we're fine, and they've raised a pull request. And it goes into, and our CI pipeline kicks off, then these are these tests that are supposed to happen in an ideal world on your CI pipeline. Static code analysis, depending on which language tool you have, there'll be some linting. Unit tests, of course. Component tests. Component test is testing one endpoint, right? That's the easiest answer I can give. It's testing one endpoint. When we go across endpoints, that is going to become an integration test. Component performance test. Usually performance is the last thing we think about, and by that time, it's just too late to change anything. Component performance is from my previous run to my this run, my response time for my endpoint ABC has risen by 20%. That's too much. Let's have a look what's happened here, right? So you're not putting a lot of stress on your system, but you have some benchmark to see how bad we've done since the last commit, right? So it's very easy for the developer to get that quick feedback and go back and see what they've done and change it. Security tests and smoke tests. Smoke tests are more acceptance tests. If you have some end-to-end tests, that's where this is happening. So that is the continuous integration phase. Again, for this one, there's a separate, few hours whole discussion that we go through. Continuous delivery is the next stage. Now we talk about integration tests. Now we've checked one component in the last in continuous integration phase. Now we talk about integration tests, which is sort of end to end, if you will, right? And also the exploratory testing that needs to happen. So we call these continuous delivery tests. To be honest, I mean, you can name it any way you want. I think from what I've experienced so far, continuous delivery tests seem like more appropriate. So these are your nightly builds, if you will, right? So you have your integration tests running on the API and system integration tests. System integration test would be if I am connecting with a third-party system or with a product which is completely out of my realm, and we're getting some data from there, and we have to use it and then pass it to someone else, that's a system integration test. And it should be done on the API, guys. This is not just because it's an end-to-end test, doesn't have to be on the UI. Anything you can do on the API has to happen on the API, right? And then you have, of course, system integration UI level tests. So these are contract test is a big one, especially if you are services heavy, which you should be in a good architecture. Contract test takes a lot of pain away, and especially when you have consumer driven contract tests. So those are the important ones for the automation. And then you have exploratory testing, of course, risk-based testing, again, outside in risk analysis, which is looking at from the customer's perspective, usability, and all those things. Regression, the reason I've added regression here isn't necessarily those regression test cases. This regression is to explain people that all the tests that we just did, all of that is regression. Regression comes from the term regress. If you are regressing something, that is regression. It doesn't have to be a separate phase where we switch off everything and we just run some test cases which are written a year ago. That is not regression, right? I mean, that's not the best way of doing regression. Let's call it that way. Customer journey tests are what I call usually end-to-end tests. What I end-to-end, sometimes people confuse the ends, so I call it customer journey. As a customer, when I interact with an application, if I have to complete one user flow for me, that whole user flow is an end-to-end test or a customer journey test, right? So for me to complete my customer journey, what do I have to do? So you can automate those, but I'm not a big fan of automating those. I think there would be a handful of these tests really, and it's best to do these manually by a person, because there's a lot of usability context which comes in, which a script will not necessarily pick up. Then we talk about the last stage is demo and release, and the operational acceptance tests, right? So you have end-to-end performance, security tests, then we go into demos. So you have your sprint demo. If you are a large organization and you are working in scaled agile, you have release trains, then you'll have a system demo where it's more of a collaboration between different teams and they collectively show how their new features are working together in a demo, right? So that's a system demo. Then you have, of course, UATs. Depending, now it's an anti-pattern, to be honest. I mean, if you're having system demos and your demos are good, you don't necessarily need a UAT then. Last one is production tests. Yes, you should have production tests, uh, especially when if you have a continuous deployment pipeline where we are deploying on a single touch. It's very helpful to have some very basic functional smoke tests. We just check if my deployment is fine. That's all, right? And usually a lot of teams do have it. It's just that it doesn't trickle down to the testers. We don't sometimes know what's happening. Performance, usage, and data quality is more around uh, business, data engineering, and data science. All right, so that was the last of the stages. And as I said earlier, keep updating this. There are revisions of this which keep coming along, and as we work and as I discuss with more people, I keep adding things and improving, and you will see revisions, and I am doing some changes in terms of making it more accessible for everyone as well. So that leads us almost to the end, almost. Now, after listening to all of this, I'm really interested in understanding. We've talked about a lot of concepts, and I've just tried to really just pique your interest in certain things, right? So, and it's really fascinating for me to understand which of these things are more near to your heart, or you would want to learn more about them, right? So let me so this is a quick poll again. I've put the link in the chat again, and if you can quickly do this poll, so that would help in understanding which sections are more important. All right, so we have some polls coming in. It's a tough one, I have to say. There are a lot of options there, and I can understand it can be tricky. Okay, so I think we have quite a couple of polls results here. So here are the results, and that's kind of what what I was expecting. Automation and testing practices 90%, Quality, vision, and culture. That is surprising, and I'm happy to see that one. Right, 50% over there. Roles and responsibilities, sprint planning, automation stages, and agile test case writing. That's very good. I'm happy to see that one too, because this is a pain. Uh, Excellent. Thank you so much. All right. So now we're going to just wrap this up real quick. I have just one or two slides to close this. Oops. Let me solve that. All right. So last 1 minute, and then we'll open for Q&A. Workshops. So I've discussed a lot of things here, right? And this is just another illustration of all the different stages we've talked about. So, and I've coined them. So build acceptance is where, this is all the CI pipeline. The product acceptance, this is all the continuous delivery that we talked about. Then we have system acceptance, which is connecting with different products across the landscape and customer journey. And then you have production acceptance, which is once deployed in production, then what's happening. And for all of these stages, we have separate sessions and workshops. I am planning to do an online version. I haven't done an online version yet, which is why, and I tried to put something together before this webinar. I couldn't. It's just been so busy. So, but keep a lookout. These workshops are coming up in an online fashion. And if there was something that was interesting to you, I think definitely these are going to be worth it. Especially with all the information overload that we have today, and it's just confusing. I know it's confusing. I mean, each person has a different notion of what's supposed to happen, how this is happening, how it's supposed to fit together. Took me a long time to just put all of this together so I can completely understand how most of the folks feel. All right, so that was all I had to talk about. I'll be really happy to answer any questions that you would have on any topic. There are a couple. There is one, I think, which I didn't answer yet. So please add any more that you would like me to answer. In the meanwhile, I'll answer the ones which I haven't talked about. Okay, so I think this one is from Sharon, and she wants to know, how do you get testability into into the strategy and team mindset? um, the problem of why testability isn't thought of as a team issue is because we have a secluded set of automation folks sitting in a corner doing some automation. The automation is not everyone's problem, right? And that is why it's hard to explain to them that, guys, look, you need to really think about testability before you build stuff, not after you've built it, right? And that's the conversation. The good way of, and the way I've seen the teams I've seen which actually manage doing this well is where there is a consensus that our tests are going to run in a pipeline. All the tests are going to run in a CI pipeline, and if the pipeline goes red, everyone is, the first priority is to fix the pipeline. That way, when tests fail, it's not just the automation guy's problem, it's everyone's problem. And until that doesn't happen, this is not going to get fixed, because again, the throw over the wall thing, right? I mean, if it is not affecting me, I'm not going to go out of the way to do this. So it has to do a lot with the culture and the mindset of the organization. But a good way to fix it is to just get this agreement that, all right, tests are going to run in the pipeline, and if the pipeline goes red, everyone jumps on and tries to fix it, right? And that is the best way of going about it. Otherwise, if that is hard to do, which I know a lot of teams don't necessarily have CI pipelines built in, and they don't have all the infrastructure, and that is a whole separate exercise. It's not, if you don't have it in place, it's not easy. So the next best thing is try to have that collaboration as soon as they're done with the user story, at least. Or even better is having the 3 amigo session. The 3 amigo session is going to turn around a lot of problems. That is the root cause of a lot of problems. And usually what teams do is we have a big sprint planning. right? We have, let's say, 10 user stories and we have 1 hour. We're not going to discuss all of those user stories in detail and talk about, okay, what are the risks and what are the acceptance tests. We don't have time for it. So the teams that do it well, they spare half an hour or 1 hour every, every day or every other day, and they refine stories on a routine basis. And that way, when they come up to sprint planning, they have done these the 3 Migo sessions for a bunch of stories, and they are extremely ready with what story they want to pick, right? And the homework is done. And a lot of these problems, just go away if that happens. I know it's hard to get there, but it's definitely worth it. All right. So I don't see any more questions here, and we are 5 minutes above, and I want to respect your time. So thank you everyone for joining. I think it was really nice to talk to you guys and hear back from you. And keep an eye out for the upcoming workshops and for upcoming webinars. I'll try to improve these and make these a routine thing. I have been lacking in this for a while, but I'm going to try and pick it up. Thank you and see you around.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you for the nice comments, guys.
Thank you, Ali.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.